Okay. Hi, Sam. How are you?
Great. Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it. I got to ask, that's a map of Minnesota behind you?
That's right. My grandfather had a passing interest in geology for much of his life. So that is a 1930s geological map of the state of Minnesota, where I was born and raised.
Okay. But currently you're in Amherst?
That's right. I teach at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So I'm here in beautiful Western Massachusetts.
Okay. Well, I know it very well. I'm a original New Englander. I moved to Las Vegas in 2005, but I grew up in New England in the Boston area. So you are an associate professor, I should say this right, in the Department of History at the University of UMass Amherst, yeah?
That's
How,
right.
how long have you had that job?
I've been here for 7 years.
And your book that we're going to be talking about is called The Museum, A Short History of Crisis and Resilience. Now, you're going to have to explain the kind of correlation there because it says explores the concept of crisis as it relates to museums. Now, there's something that I never would have put together in one sentence. How did you put that together?
Sure. So back in 2020, January 2020, I was part of a panel exploring questions about what a museum should be and what the present state of museums were and what they might be in the future. And I was approached following that conversation by a publisher asking me if I was potentially interested in writing a book about that same topic. But to be honest, I walked away from the conversation not exactly sure like what my book on that question might be or look like. But then, as I'm sure your listeners remember, everything really changed dramatically in the next few weeks and months after that. And crisis was really on my mind. And as a historian who's really interested in the history of museums, I couldn't help but think about how museums had responded to crisis moments in the past 100 years or so. So I started looking back at the 1918 influenza epidemic, commonly known as the Spanish flu. And what I found was that there were only a few things written about how museums had dealt with those crisis moments in the past 100 years. And it ended up being really revealing what it told me, not just about the history of museums, but about US society in general.
Well, it's interesting because we've had, like you said, the COVID pandemic, which has shaken up everybody over the last 3 years. There's all kinds of stuff going on. The war in Ukraine, the economy, violence, school shootings. I mean, everything seems to be going on all at the same time. But when I think about those things, I don't think about a museum in the same thought. It doesn't kind of connect with me. What
Sure.
exactly do museums do?
Yeah, sure. So there are a whole host of museums, right, in the United States that have developed, especially since the time of the Civil War, when there were about 300 museums in the country. But then following that, I mean, they really emerged and took hold in many different spaces, especially urban spaces across the country. And so it's an interesting story because we sort of think of museums sometimes as being almost trapped or encased in amber, like they're unchanging. They maybe occupy a 100-year-old building and have very old paintings or other objects inside of them. But in fact, right, they are responding to these crisis moments. And pertinent to your question, one of the core arguments of my book becomes that it's rarely just one thing, right? If you think back to the time period around the 1918 influenza, what else was going on in that moment? The end of the First World War, troops coming home from the First World War, and a really shaky economy before the 1920s. It really takes off right during the 1920s. But there was also a huge amount of labor unrest in that moment, huge number of strikes happening at that time, and racial violence, white supremacist mobs that were attacking Black Americans, including Black veterans coming home from the First World War. So that moment, it struck me as almost eerily reminiscent, right, of some of the challenges that we're facing now. But I think museum leaders or people who care about museums or like to think about challenges or crisis moments, one of the really arguments of this book becomes that they should be prepared from a number of different directions and thinking about how these calamities can sort of co-join or happen at the same time.
Well, how does the museum represent what's going on at that moment? Do they change their displays?
So it sort of depends on the crisis moment is one of the things that I found is that, the book traces several different crisis moments over the course of the last 150 years or so. But one of the things that was sort of interesting to me as I started thinking about crisis moments, and this sounds sort of silly almost on its how superficial this is, but I opened a dictionary and I looked up the word crisis in the dictionary. And something to be reminded of was that we sort of have this idea that crisis sort of implies impending doom, like expressions like financial crisis or oil crisis, which sort of seem really bad, right? But in fact, a crisis is sort of a key turning point or a crossroads or a crescendo in a story, right? So that tipping point can sort of go either way. And what I found is that sometimes when museums lean into these crisis moments and take them seriously and think about how they might best respond, they actually become more resilient in the end. They become stronger, even though those moments were difficult to deal with. But for example, I tell the story of the 1970 art strike, where a group of artists come together in the city of New York, and they try to shut museums down for the day in a series of anti-war protests and protests that are about sexism and inequality. And in many respects, they're really ahead of their time in what some of the artists are calling for. They also sort of, I think, kind of naively think that art is the solution to everything. More art will sort of solve the world's problems. But the museum, the Met in particular, sort of it gives them the cold shoulder in responding to the artists' concerns of the 1970s. And frankly, they were anticipating a lot of the direction that the Met needed to go in the future in order to work better with the community and be more resilient in the long run. So it's a really mixed bag, which made it fascinating to study over time how museums have responded to these different crisis moments.
Okay, well, the last one that we just went through was COVID, and I'm going to assume that most of the museums in the United States got shut down during that, right?
More than 90% of museums, according to some of the studies that I'd seen, yes.
So how did they come out of this? What changed?
So one of the initial things that really had to change, right? So in addition to staff cutbacks and furloughs, things of that nature, things like major exhibition plans where massive exhibits were to be staged, those had to be dialed back or in some cases eliminated entirely. But again and again, when I looked at all of these crisis moments, I also saw certain opportunities that came about with all of these crisis moments. So I'd sort of been reflecting, and I think other people have as well, on, well, what are the opportunities here? And I think three of them really come to mind, two or three. And one is the turn towards the digital platforms. I mean, with school shutdowns and quarantine and remote work and remote learning, people are looking for a greater number of high quality sources that tell truthful and factual information about science and about art and history. So that digital sort of expansion of digital platforms was one sort of obvious early outcome. But now as museums are opening back up, a couple of things, the surveys are starting to suggest that museum visitors in this moment are starting to be younger, and they're coming from nearby, they're more local. So people aren't yet making these long journeys to museums across the country as often as they were in 2019 yet. But maybe this gives an opportunity for museums and other cultural institutions to connect with younger visitors, to connect with visitors that are close by who maybe haven't gone to that museum for one reason or another for the last couple of years, and an opportunity to connect and bring new visitors in. So we're still sort of in it, as your question suggested, and we don't exactly know where museums are going. But to me, as someone who's just taken this on this project, I think a take-home point would be that we need to examine our history and think more broadly about not just the origins of these institutions, but how have they dealt with challenges like hurricanes and fires and floods and epidemics in the past in order to understand how to respond to these challenges today.
Do you think that museums need to be politically correct in terms of not displaying material that could be offensive to people, or should it just be open, that everything needs to be on display? You can choose whether you want to go look at it or not.
So one of the episodes that I look in this book is the Enola Gay, the story of the airplane, the B-29 Enola Gay airplane, which dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare on Hiroshima in Japan. And of course, how to display this in the 1990s becomes a really controversial question. Professional historians and curators want to look at the whole truth of the story. They want to look at the situation from all sides. And veterans groups in particular, and some conservative groups really pushed back, and this creates this huge firestorm that becomes a national media event. So arguably in the 1990s and 2000s, there was really a chilling effect in terms of how whether or not museums could take on questions related to controversy or controversial topics. And then there's also been looming questions about the repatriation or return of sensitive materials. So I'm going to try to answer the question in a couple different ways. I think that museums should, in fact, take on and directly address controversial questions or questions that people are thinking about. I think in some instances, some communities need to hear hard truths. It can't just be celebration all the time, but it also can't just be hard, jarring truths all the time. There needs to be space for joy and expression in that way. But yes, I also, my previous books about human remains and the history of anthropology, I mean, that's all really led me to think that museums can and should do better in terms of displaying religiously sensitive or sacred objects or human remains. I think we have a long way to go still in terms of addressing some of the darker corners of these histories. But honestly, then too, I think that these sort of challenges in many respects create opportunities, because they open up important conversations. They bring people into the museum that maybe wouldn't have been there otherwise. And we can think more expansively about what a museum even is to begin with. So those are really important challenges, and ones that I think have been dealt with differently over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. And I think we need to more fully think about that story when we think about the history of the United States, cultural institutions, and museums.
Well, I'm just wondering if the place of a museum is to have a political agenda, or should it just be a kind of an unbiased, display, if you will, exhibition of artifacts and things without sending a message to people?
I think there's a little bit of both as far as a sort of a realistic hope for the future, because on the one hand, I think there needs to be a mission, right? Like museums and a good exhibit, much like a good book or a good movie, there's a point to it. There's
Okay,
an
so
argument,
that's
right?
the thing. There needs to be a point of some kind
right.
to it. Yeah.
But on the other hand, I will say too, here we are in the great era of fake news and false information.
Right.
Museums are considered generally, the survey suggests that museums are considered a fairly trusted source of information. So I argue that they really need to take that seriously and cherish that, and not take advantage exactly, but make sure that people have access to sound and accurate information as often as possible.
Well, I agree with you. Well, Sam, we got to wind this down. We just kind of shot right through our 15 minutes here. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
So I am on Twitter at Samuel J. Redman. And if people look up my name, Samuel J. Redman, they'll find both a faculty landing page at UMass where there are links to all of my books and articles. I also have an Amazon author page. And like they like to say, You can find my books wherever good books are sold, that sort of a thing.
All right. We'll put your Twitter handle up on the screen for people. So if they want to say hi to you,
Cool.
they can. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was nice meeting you. Best of luck with the book. The book is out now. It's available.
Yes, it is. I'm holding it in my little paws, and I'm
Okay.
excited to finally